Folks, Why Would You Ask That is a podcast that answers some of the weirdest questions. A lot of those are inappropriate for some listeners. If you're squeamish, easily disturbed, or just having a bad day, this may not be for you. But if you've got to know the answers like we do, stay tuned.
Hey folks, it's Remy, he, him, one of the hosts, and it's just me this week. This is Thanksgiving week, so we're not having a traditional episode because some of us are traveling. Not me, I'm at home. So, because some of us are traveling, I'm just doing something just me this week so that we can put up just like a probably mini episode because I just want to talk about Thanksgiving and the first Thanksgiving. I thought I'd talk about what's really behind this week. We've talked about the pumpkins and pumpkin pie and Sarah Josepha Hale and her quest to force the American public to celebrate Thanksgiving. We talked about how Sarah wrote a lovely story about the Native Americans and the Pilgrims all coming together to have a nice little meal together where everyone ate turkey and pumpkins. I have quite a large bit of indigenous ancestry coming from 3 different tribes, and one of them comes up from that area. And some of my indigenous ancestry is actually fairly even close to me. They're like close in the generations to me. So I've been trying really hard to connect with that part of my ancestry. And I want to talk about this because I don't like where Thanksgiving started. And I don't like that every year my kids come home with like the same mythologized beginning of Thanksgiving story, and that so many schools just don't address any of the reality of the situation of what happened then. So I'm going to talk about it. I think a lot of people are aware that the story of the first Thanksgiving is a myth, or at least are aware that some of it is anyway. In fact, much of the story is myth and historical inaccuracy, and if you look at the book This Land is Their Land, The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving by David Silverman, he says that by continuing to spread the myth, it's a continuation of harm to the Wampanoag people whose lives and society were forever damaged after the English arrived. And I think we need to recontextualize our thoughts around Thanksgiving in the same way that we have all, as a larger society, started to recontextualize our thoughts around Columbus Day as a whole. Like, because if you ask people, by and large, you can find videos on YouTube and stuff responding to the idea of Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving story. That's not great, their feelings toward it. And Native Americans throughout the majority of the United States have very uncomfortable feelings around this holiday. So let's start talking about this story. Let's start before the story, with the real first meetings between the Wampanoag and the English. In 1614, Captain Thomas Hunt had anchored his ship in the harbor of the Wampanoag community, Patuxet, the very site where the colony of Plymouth would be founded 6 years later, and invited curious members of the tribe on board. Though the natives were wary of the situation, the lure of trade was too enticing for either party to resist. Europeans sought furs, particularly beaver pelts, to sell back home. The Wampanoags wanted to pick through the strangers' merchandise of metal tools, jewelry, and cloth, and so a number of them, including a man named Tisquantum, or you would know him as Squanto, because as I'm aware through my education, the schools largely don't teach his full name. They all went aboard Hunt's vessel. Instead of trading, Hunt seized 20 of their men and held them captive below decks. Soon, 7 other Wampanoags further east fell into the same trap, joining their tribesmen on a horrific oceanic journey towards enslavement in Spain. That is the last we hear of most of these unfortunate souls who disappeared into Iberia's mass of bound laborers drawn from around the globe. Tisquantum very nearly shared this end, but for 2 strokes of fortune. First, a group of friars blocked his sail, doubtlessly citing a routinely ignored Spanish law that Native Americans should not be enslaved. Then, after an uncertain period of time, Tisquantum made contact with one of many English merchants who, in turn, took him to London. So in 1618, Tisquantum got his chance to return to his native land. He was introduced to Captain Thomas Dermer, who, back in 1614, had been part of the very exploring and fishing expedition that had kidnapped Tisquantum in the first place. So by this point, Tisquantum had learned enough English to offer his services to Dermer in exchange. Yet when Dermer set sail for the New England coast that spring, he knew that he was heading to a place with a growing reputation for violence between Native Americans and European explorers. Harrowing stories of the two peoples capturing and killing each other had been in circulation among sailors for years. As for Tisquantum, his heart must have been ready to burst with relief because 5 years of forced exile were about to end. Doubtless, Tisquantum had already heard from English sailors that a terrible disease had struck the Wampanoags during his absence, but there was no way for him to prepare. The ship sailed south along a coastline usually teeming with people at work in their cornfields and villages. This time, however, there was no one to be seen or heard. According to Nathaniel Morton, who visited Plymouth in 1622 and went on to become Plymouth Colony's secretary and historian, Patuxet and the surrounding country had turned into, quote, a sad spectacle of mortality, end quote. They exhibited, quote, many bones and skulls of the dead lying above the ground, end quote, like inverted cemeteries. The exuberant homecoming Tisquantum had been imagining for years had instead uncovered a tragedy of epic proportion. The majority of the Wampanoags had died while he was gone. So let's pause for 1 second. When I learned in school, and when my kids have learned in school about the first Thanksgiving, Squanto is introduced as being somebody who was like an ambassador of sorts, somebody who like was a go-between between the Wampanoag people and the Pilgrims to translate because he knew English. I think when I was taught it, he knew English because he had learned it from traders, was what I was taught. And I don't think my children were taught anything about how he knew English. So now you know, if you didn't know before, that because that he knew English because he was in bondage for 5 years over in England. And now we go back. Let's shift and talk about things from the Pilgrim side of things. When the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620, the Wampanoag chief, Usamiquin, offered the new arrivals an alliance, largely to have extra protection from their own rivals. For 50 years, this alliance was tested by the Europeans by colonial land expansion, the spread of disease, and the exploitation of resources on Wampanoag land, and then King Philip's War happened, and the balance of power forever shifted to the Europeans. So let's take the myth and start breaking it apart further. There's the basic idea that the Wampanoag and the settlers met in 1620 and had their first Thanksgiving in 1621 to celebrate their peaceful alliance. But the first peaceful meal between native tribes and settlers happened even just way before then. If you want to just cite the first meal that Indigenous people and Europeans of some variety had together in peace with each other, then we have to pick a different, even area of the country as the first meal where Indigenous people and Europeans sat down together and had a peaceful meal together. So, decades before, Spanish settlers and members of the Timucua tribe broke bread in Florida with salted pork, garbanzo beans, and they had mass in 1560, according to the National Park Service. So, I mean, I just wanted to mention it because it's an entirely different date and an entirely different seating between the two groups of people. But other than that, what the Pilgrims would have been doing during this time of year was more like a harvest celebration that took place sometime between September and November, and it was less peaceful meal of alliance with local tribes, and according to historians, was probably just a day of fasting and prayer, which would have started initially in 1619. They would have they would have initially started having some sort of thing during this time of the year then when they had started establishing colonies as a way to fast, from what I've been reading from historians, because they didn't have enough food. So fasting made their foods last longer. But then when they were able to harvest their foods, they would have a big meal as giving thanks to God for the bounty that they now had. So they were doing that before anybody ever sat down with any indigenous people to have any kind of alliance or give thanks for anything. The date that I see most frequently quoted when people are trying to refute the myth of the first Thanksgiving as the first Thanksgiving happened in 1637. That's usually the refutation that I see other people making, like on Facebook and stuff. So I want to talk about 1637 now. In 1630, on that day, the Massachusetts colony governor John Winthrop proclaimed such a, quote, Thanksgiving to celebrate the safe return of a band of heavily armed hunters from the colonies who had just returned from what is now Mystic, Connecticut, where they had massacred 700 Pequot natives. That's the first time that the word Thanksgiving in that way is written down somewhere. They had all sat down and given thanks and eaten something, and it was used like that. That's where people on like Facebook and other social medias are quoting that date and that word from when they're saying that actually that's where the first Thanksgiving is coming from. So that day and that word usage comes from the giving thanks for the safe return after a massacre of indigenous people, in the event that you didn't know that. People do still remember this day, but not as the first Thanksgiving. Members of a group called the United American Indians of New England meet every year at Plymouth Rock to remember the event as a day of mourning. The point being that no one knows the exact literal date in which the point being that no one knows exactly which of these or which date at all is the one people are actually referring to when referring to the first Thanksgiving. Nobody knows exactly when it happened. The events where some people on the English side and some people on the Wampanoag side sat down and ate together. Nobody knows when that happened. Most likely, they're just talking about that harvest festival, and it just lost the religious overtones over time. The point being that no one knows exactly when, nobody knows exactly when this sit down feasting happened with the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims. 1621 is when it's believed that they had their peaceful alliance and they sat down and they had the meal that people now think of as the first Thanksgiving. So let's just talk about the history of the Pilgrims. Textbooks often indicate the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts because the harsh winter was approaching or a storm sent them off course from their original Virginia destination. Here's a quote. Quote, Winter's onset cannot have been the reason, however, for the weather would be much milder in Virginia than Massachusetts. Moreover, the Pilgrims spent 6 full weeks until December 26th scouting around Cape Cod looking for the best spot, end quote. From James Lowen, who wrote his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. So here's some more from him. Quote, Historian George Willison has argued that the Pilgrim leaders, wanting to be far from Anglican control, never planned to settle in Virginia. They had debated the relative merits of Guyana and South America versus the Massachusetts coast, and according to Willison, they intended a hijacking. Certainly, the Pilgrims already knew quite a bit about what Massachusetts could offer them, from the fine fishing along Cape Cod to that, quote, wonderful plague, end quote, which offered an unusual opportunity for English settlement, end Lowen's quote. And now we can talk about that plague that has been mentioned twice. Once up there when talking about Tisquantum's return to Massachusetts, and now in Lowen's quote. Another thing I think most people are aware of is that when the Europeans arrived, they brought diseases that wasn't here in the U.S. before. Indigenous Americans rarely got sick from poor hygiene, livestock, or conditions in their villages, but places in Europe and in England specifically, people just didn't bathe as much, believing it unhealthy, and rarely removed all of their clothing at one time, believing it immodest. But as I'm setting records straight on one end, I do want to take an aside here to talk baths, because I can't set things straight on the other end and then cite something that is largely a myth on the other end. So this is another commonly said thing, that people in the 15 and 1600s didn't bathe. But that's not entirely true. So for this aside, I'm just going to talk about England and white Europe as countries with large populations of color, or the Vikings were generally practicing better bathing in their general public than they were in England or other parts of Europe. So we're just going to talk about white Europeans right now. Personal hygiene did exist in the Middle Ages, aware that cleaning their face and hands was a good idea. It was believed that there was a strong connection between bathing and eating, which could affect one's overall health. Baths could relieve digestion and stop diarrhea, but taken improperly could lead to weakness of the heart, nausea, or fainting. Medieval writers saw bathing as a serious and careful activity. One medical treatise, the Secreta Secretorum, has an entire section on baths. It's like pages long. It notes that the spring and winter are good times for bathing, but that you should absolutely not be bathing in the summer. It also warns that excessively long baths lead to fatness and feebleness. Records from medieval England show that its kings often enjoyed these baths. Charlemagne loved taking baths, and that, quote, he would invite not only his sons to bathe with him, but his nobles and friends as well, and occasionally even a crowd of attendants and bodyguards, so that sometimes 100 men or more would be in the water together, end quote. Which, frankly, that just sounds terrible. It doesn't sound very hygienic, but that's me. So for most people, having a private bath was not an option. It was simply just too costly and too time consuming for their own baths. That does not mean that they went without bathing, though. Public baths were very common throughout Europe. In her book Clean, A History of Personal Hygiene and Purity, in her book Clean, A Personal Hygiene of In her book Clean, A History of Personal Hygiene and Purity, Virginia Smith explains, quote, by the 15th century, bath feasting in many town bathhouses seems to have been as common as going out to a restaurant was to become 4 centuries later. German bath etchings from the 15th century often feature the town bathhouse with a long row of bathing couples eating a meal naked in bathtubs, often several to a tub, end quote. The public bathhouses where the common folk were able to spend time bathing were places where all number of businesses set up shop as well. And some surgeons practiced their trade, and some bakeries did business right next to the water. In many, they served as a place to pick up sex workers and partake in their trade right there and get washed up after. The public waters at a bathhouse were not going to keep you very hygienically clean. But to the Middle Ages standards, they thought it was fine. By the 1500s, public bathhouses had gone away in Europe anyway, and they wouldn't come back again until the 1800s. So this is what I say when I'm saying that the pilgrims who came over here were most hygienic, because even the ones who were bathing, the ones who could afford to do it and had the time to do it, they weren't doing it in the most hygienic of settings. And for a lot of Native American societies, they didn't have the same kinds of belief about personal hygiene as Europeans did. They were generally more cleanly and hygienic about their washing up. So when the pilgrims showed up over here, they smelled bad to the indigenous people of the region. Tisquantum said that he tried to teach them to bathe, but without success, according to his biographer, Feeney Ziner. In fact, 3 years before the pilgrims landed, English and French fishermen transmitted diseases to the tribes as they came ashore to find fresh water, firewood, and capture Native Americans for the slave trade. Quote, within 3 years, the plague wiped out between 90 to 96% of the inhabitants of coastal New England. Native societies were devastated, end quote, says Robert Cushman, an English eyewitness, reporting a death rate unknown to all previous human experience. Quoted from Lowen, that last bit. So, yeah. Those who did survive left their communities to join others, bringing the illnesses along with them. This caused many Native Americans to perish, even though they did not encounter Europeans at all. Once the Pilgrims did arrive in 1620, the epidemics across that area were far from over. To English separationists, they viewed the sickness that came before them as divine providence and a sign that God willed them to take over that land. Where Tisquantum's village once thrived, the Pilgrims established Plymouth Plantation. During this time, the Wampanoag lost up to 75% of its people, while a nearby enemy tribe, the Narragansett, did not. When the Wampanoag watched the Mayflower's passengers come ashore at Patuxet, they did not see them as a threat. Quote, the Wampanoag had seen many ships before, explained Tim Turner, Cherokee, manager of Plymouth Plantation's Wampanoag home site and co-owner of Native Plymouth Tours. Quote, They had seen traders and fishermen, but they had not seen women and children before. In the Wampanoag ways, they never would have brought their women and children into harm, so they saw them as a peaceful people for that reason. End quote. Wampanoag leader Usamiquin saw the Pilgrims as allies. The English, in fact, did not see the Wampanoag that first winter at all, according to Turner. Quote, they saw shadows, he said. Samoset, a Mohican from Maine, came to the village on 1621. The next day, he returned with Tisquantum, who helped the English that spring, showing them how to plant corn, fish, and gather berries and nuts. That March, the Pilgrims entered into a treaty of mutual protection with Usamiquin, and then the treaty established an understanding that the tribe would look out for the Pilgrims against their enemies and vice versa. Quote, Tisquantum's travels acquainted him with more of the world than any pilgrim encountered. He had crossed the Atlantic perhaps 6 times, twice as an English captive, and had lived in Maine, Newfoundland, Spain, and England, as well as Massachusetts. All of this brings us to Thanksgiving. End quote from Lowen, and Lies My Teacher Told Me. What most people don't know about the first Thanksgiving is that the Wampanoag and Pilgrims did not sit down for a big turkey dinner, and it was not an event that the Wampanoag even knew about, and they were not invited to it. In September to October of 1621, the Pilgrims had just harvested their first crops, and they had a good yield. They, quote, sent 4 men on fowling, end quote, which comes from one paragraph account by Pilgrim Edward Winslow, one of only 2 historical sources of this famous harvest feast. Winslow also stated, quote, we exercised our arms, end quote. So the Pilgrims celebrated their successful harvest in 1621 by shooting their guns in the air. Very American, which caused the Wampanoags to bring together warriors and come to the aid of the English because they thought that their allies were in harm, so they were coming to help them. Instead of fighting, the Wampanoag and Pilgrims worked together to prepare a feast. So when the Wampanoag showed up, they were just invited to eat with them, but there was not enough food to feed the chief and the 90 warriors that he brought with him. Quote, he sends his men out, and they bring back 5 deer, which they present to the chief of the English town, William Bradford. So there is this whole ceremonial gift-giving as well. When you give it as a gift, it is more than just food, end quote, said Kathleen Wall, a colonial foodways culinarian at Plymouth Plantation. The feast lasted for 3 days total, and you might be wondering if they ate turkey, like most of us do, and you should definitely know, based on our previous episodes, that they were absolutely not eating pumpkin pie. So what they did eat, that we know that they ate, venison, of course, but Wall says, quote, not just a lovely roasted joint of venison, but all the parts of the deer were on the table, and who knows how many sorts of ways, end quote. The colonists didn't have potatoes, nor did they have butter or flour necessary for making pies. The Pilgrims hadn't even built their first oven by the time of the first Thanksgiving. Cranberries might have been served, but only for color or tartness instead of as a sauce. Neither Bradford or Winslow's writing reveal what was actually served at the first Thanksgiving meal, besides fowl and deer, but guesses can be made based on the types of food they often wrote about, so mussels, lobster, grapes, plums, corn, and other herbs. There's no actual proof that the colonists ate turkey at all. Turkey wasn't even associated with Thanksgiving until an editor of a magazine called Godey's Lady's Book came across Edward Winslow's writings about the feast in the 1840s, and that was Sarah Josepha Hale, who we talked about before on the pumpkin pie episode. But if you didn't listen to that episode, she's the one who wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, just so you have the context of who she is and why you should know who she is. Just to give you that touchstone. She loved pumpkins so much that she wrote a shit ton of poems about them, and she really loved Thanksgiving. So much so that she campaigned for 40 years for us to celebrate Thanksgiving in the entirety of this country. She read Winslow's writings. She decided to bring this historic celebration back to life. Up until then, Thanksgiving was only a regional New England holiday and wasn't celebrated basically anywhere else. Hale focused her attention on that brief sentence about the colonists' hunt for wild turkeys that fall. Quote, and besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many besides venison, etc. End quote. Bradford wrote. Despite the fact that Bradford never stated that they ate turkey on Thanksgiving, Hale started publishing articles about Thanksgiving dinners with roasted turkey, and the two have just become synonymous. Thanksgiving as a holiday didn't become a thing people did until the Continental Congress declared the first national Thanksgiving on December 18th, 1777. Future presidents did not stick with it at all, and so it never did become a holiday until Sarah Josepha Hale started writing all those letters trying to get people to do it and eat pumpkin. Abraham Lincoln picked up the torch in 1863. In an article published by Indian Country Today in 2011, Thanksgiving Day is a time of grief for Native Americans. Many natives continue to gather at Coles Hill near Plymouth Rock and remember the losses experienced for the past 400 plus years through the National Day of Mourning. The event began in 1970 when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts invited Wamsuta James to address the public on behalf of the Wampanoag people. However, once organizers learned the subject of his speech, which included highlighting the death and broken promises at the hand of settlers, colonial powers, and the United States, James was no longer invited. So this prompted the formation of the National Day of Mourning. James wrote, quote, "This action by Massasoit, which is another name for Usamiquin, this action by Massasoit was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end." End quote. So the only reason that we even have it now, aside from that letter writing campaign, is that Abraham Lincoln picked it up, and Abraham Lincoln picked it up because he needed a distraction and a wartime peace offering during the Civil War. The myth of the first Thanksgiving was influenced by the politics of the time, by the desire to give readers and listeners a sense of belonging in this country. After the Civil War, that the Indigenous people welcomed them here, consented to their colonization, even there was both the Civil War and there was the quote unquote Indian Wars coming to a close right there in the 1860s and Reconstruction starting. It was the perfect time to craft a story that said, look, these people of color, they welcomed us here onto their land and willingly gave it to us. They celebrated us being here by giving us food and eating with us. They knew we had way better stuff and they wanted that also. So everyone was happy and everything was bloodless and the natives just went off and let us have what we want. And that Thanksgiving myth allowed New Englanders to create this idea that bloodless colonialism in their region was the origin of the country, having nothing to do with the Indian Wars and slavery, and there was no taking the natives as captives to England included in their story, and there was no huge massacre of nearly 700 natives followed by that feast. And the myth meant Americans could feel good about their colonial past without having to confront the really dark characteristics of it. Not to say, please do not mistake me, that New England itself and the people currently living there have literally anything to do with it, because I live in the South. And even as somebody who has so much indigenous ancestry, living here in the South, we have so much of a problem with indigenous people and racial stuff. So I'm not responsible for that stuff, and you current New England people have nothing to do with that either. But that was the narrative of how Thanksgiving got from there to here. So now, so that we can come off of that and into something that's not sad, we can talk about ways you can spend time today, Thanksgiving, recognizing it without celebrating it, or if it's past Thanksgiving and you're listening to this, next Thanksgiving. Personally, I still do things on Thanksgiving, with my family. I've talked to my children about like the historical roots as best I can because they're still young. I tend to just have quiet moments in the beginning of the day, remembering all of this stuff that went before me, and then going about my day afterwards to think about how we're still fighting, and then I just have to move it aside so that I can spend time with my family and my children and my husband and my grandparents. We have a big meal. We eat turkey, of course, because I mean that's the thing we do now. We eat turkey. Turkey is very good, and I like turkey. We spend time being thankful for the things that we have, for the things that we've accomplished this year. That's what I'm doing. So, things that you can do if you want to learn how to like decolonize your thinking about Thanksgiving. Here's some thoughts, some suggestions if like you're just learning about all of this, or if you knew some stuff or knew all of it but just want some ways that you can learn more. Here's some suggestions, and I'll link a full article onto the resource page for our bonus episode here that you can click on, videos and things for all sorts of children of all sorts of ages. And there's a game on there that I've had my daughter play and she loved it and learned a lot, and so on. If you're a teacher, there's all kinds of teaching resources on there that's free for teachers to use, etc. So first, you can just start by learning whose land that you're on. In the article I'll post, you can click on a link in this step, which will take you to a map that shows you your area's indigenous peoples and languages. So for mine, where I'm living right now, it's Quapaw and Osage. You can just learn the history, which you've just done if you listen to this. You can just mark this off of your to-do list. There's tons of good links on this bulleted list that I'm going to link to you, and videos about the history step. A lot of them come from the Plymouth and Patuxent Living Museums up in Massachusetts, which looks like a really cool place to visit if you're up in that general area. You can There was a suggestion on there that was listed as decolonize your dinner, which just meant to think about trying out foods that you would normally eat. So, Native chefs have created a culinary movement with the goal of getting Indigenous people to honor their ancestors through their dietary choices. Bring Native American dishes to the dinner table if you want to. You've still got your turkey, but like you could try the suggestion was marinating it overnight in salt water and maple syrup, juniper berries, and sage, or some amaranth corn pudding with amaranth seeds and flour, maple syrup, and cornstalk and coconut milk. There was a recipe for red bean soup with toasted sunflower seeds. There was a lot of recipes. I will probably go through them and look for things that is like reasonable for the area I'm living in to get those ingredients and or order them and then let my husband cook things because he's the one who cooks. Listen to Indigenous voices. You've already been doing that if you've been listening to this, but you should do it more. There's a podcast link in the resources and two videos, one from a teen girl Wampanoag and one from a Black Wampanoag person to talk about their unique experiences. Celebrate Native people. For many years, Native people were silenced and their stories were marginalized about their feelings towards this day. So that's why it's especially important to read stories about Native characters told in Native voices. So many links are on the list that I'm going to link. Buy Native this holiday, like with small business shopping online or when you were supporting Black businesses during those weeks. Like, think about supporting Native businesses sometimes. There will be lots of links also for this. Share positive representation of Native people. You could think about participating in the End Racist Mascots in Sports petitions that go around. There's still more than 1,000 high school, university, and professional teams that continue to have Native American mascots that largely Indigenous people don't enjoy. Though changes have been made at the high school and college levels, at the professional level, there has been like virtually no change. Lots and lots and lots of links are on that list that I'm going to put where it will take you to like petitions that you can sign. And this doesn't just apply to Native American stuff either. Those petitions will also link you to like racist imagery and mascots for African American people or Hispanic people and so on. Um, or if you're interested, and if you're up in that area somewhere, you can attend the Day of Mourning up around Plymouth, or you could attend the Alcatraz Sunrise Gathering. The website I'm going to link will give you a lot of info about those things, but basically the Day of Mourning happens at Plymouth Rock area, and the Alcatraz Sunrise Gathering happens there, where they are every year going out in a small protest to ask for that island where Alcatraz is to be given back to them, because when that island was taken away from Indigenous people, there was a treaty signed that said that if it was ever unoccupied, it would be given back, and it has not been ever given back now that it's not being used anymore, and they're refusing to give it back. So, well, that's my spiel. The others told me that they wanted me to be able to put this up today for you guys to all hear the real true story of Thanksgiving, because that's what we do here is we talk about the real true history of things. So if you listened all the way through, I hope that you learned something. And if you didn't learn something and you already knew all these things, I hope you enjoyed listening to it anyway. Like, I hope that I'm a good enough storyteller that it was engaging for you. So I'm not the one who usually does the outros, and I don't think I'm very good at it, but we'll see you next week where we will be back to like a much lighter topic. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please do not be afraid to email us your suggestions. We really love getting suggestions from all of you guys too for topic suggestions or weird questions of any sort of variety. Please send them to us. Okay, bye.
But thanks everybody for listening. So what you can do is you could visit our website, which is whywouldyouskthat.com, and go to that little contact form, throw in a question, or you can email us at whywouldyouskthatpod@gmail.com. So please send us your questions. We don't care how weird it is, how gross it is. Just don't ask any personal questions. That's our one line. Ask your weird questions. That's what we want. So thank you for listening, and ask us some shit. Thank you. Good night.